Have you ever been told to stay away from a place? Not asked, told. Not the offhand kind of warning a man gives you about a bad road or a mean dog, but the other kind. The kind that comes with weight behind it. The kind where the person telling you goes still while they say it and looks at you a beat too long after, and you feel your stomach tighten before your mind is caught up to why. If you have had that, hold on to the feeling. You are going to need it tonight. Before I begin, tell me where you are listening from. Drop it down in the comments. I like to know the places this voice reaches on a given night. And I will tell you, now and then somebody names a town not 40 miles from a story I'm about to tell, and does not know it yet. One thing first. If this is the kind of account you find you want more of, I have put 10 of them together into a long night's listening. I call the Lantern Records. 5 hours. 10 counties. The same voice you are hearing now, telling the ones that would not fit into a single sitting. You will find it in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Go and look when this is over. Now then, this happened in the summer of 1911, in the high country of northern Utah, up where the ranches give out and the peaks start, in a stretch of mountains that even now has almost nobody in it. Back then there was less than nobody. The nearest town, worth the name, was a day and a half down a wagon road that was mud in spring and washboard in summer, and the people who lived in the high valleys between were cattle families who had been on that ground since the 1860s, and a few old prospectors still turning over rock for silver that had quit paying before their fathers were born. It was country that either made a man or finished him, and the ones who had stayed were the ones it had made into something about as yielding as the rock. The man this happened to was named Edmund Croft. He was 38 years old that summer, a topographer for the United States Geological Survey, and he had spent the better part of 12 years putting the blank corners of the Western map onto paper. He was tall and spare, built like a man who walked 20 miles in a day and did not make a story of it, with sandy hair going thin and a way of squinting at the middle distance, even indoors, as though some part of him was always shooting a line and reading off the number. His hands were hard from rope and tripod legs, but they went delicate and exact the moment he had an instrument under them, the way a rough-handed man's will when the thing he is touching is the thing he loves. Croft did not care much for company. He had taken the Utah work on purpose because it meant a whole season alone with his angles, and the only voices for weeks would be his own and the weather's. There is a kind of man the empty country makes, and Croft was the far end of it. He had learned young that people were unpredictable in a way that ground was not. A mountain would lie to you, but it lied the same way every time. And if you were patient and exact, you could learn the shape of its lying and correct for it. And in the end, the mountain would tell you the truth. People were not like that. So he had given his life to the high country and kept it from the people. And he was, at 38, good at his work and not much else, and at peace with the trade. He trusted 3 things in this world: the level, the chain, and the transit. And what those 3 told him he believed, and what they could not tell him, he had decided a long time ago, did not need believing. Hold on to that about him. It is the whole of why he went, and the whole of why what happened to him broke the part of him it broke. The job was plain enough on paper. The survey wanted proper maps of the high country that had been crossed only once before, back in the 1870s, by men with worse instruments and not much time, who had brought down sketches more hopeful than accurate. Croft's task was to set permanent benchmarks, read elevations true, tie his positions to the peaks he could already place, and leave behind maps a man could trust for the next 50 years, whether what the next men wanted out of that country was timber or ore or water. He had been working up from the low valleys since the snow softened, and by the middle of June he was ready to go higher, into ground that on the old maps was not wrong so much as simply empty, a place where the paper just stopped having anything to say. He had hired a packer to get his outfit into the back country, a local man named Roy Meacham. Roy was 26, broad and strong, fourth generation, on a ranch in the valley below, on ground his great-grandfather had run cattle over, since before Utah was a state. He knew the high country the way you know a thing you were raised inside of, and he was easy with mules, in a way that came from liking them, and not just using them, patient on bad ground, quiet by nature, which suited Croft fine. They had been 6 weeks together by the time this starts, and they had worn into the easy two-man rhythm that comes when both men are good at their work, and neither needs to be told the obvious. They had set a base camp at about 9,000 feet, in a meadow by a creek that ran cold and quick off the snowfields even in summer, and from there, they had been making day climbs to set benchmarks and take readings, and coming back down each evening to eat and sleep. The weather had been kind. They were ahead of schedule. And from a ridge, 2 days before, Croft had put his glass on something that interested him. A high valley, glacial, narrow, running north and south, hung between 2 steep ridges at something near 11,000 feet, with a flat floor and good clear sight lines to 4 peaks he could already name. It was not on the old maps, or if it was a smudge a man could not swear to. From the ridge, it had looked like clean 2-day work, and Croft had marked it to do. They were loading the mules on the morning of the 19th of June, when the old man came up the trail. Neither of them heard him until he was nearly into the meadow, which Croft thought about a good deal afterward, because Roy heard everything, and the mules heard more than Roy, and not one of them had marked the old man's coming. One moment the camp was just the 2 of them, and the animals and the creek, and the next there was a third man standing at the meadow's edge, watching, with a face that gave away nothing at all. He was old. Ute, Roy said later, and Roy would know, his family having lived alongside the Ute bands the better part of a century. Somewhere past 70, though the sun and the wind had worked his face to where you could not have sworn to it. Deep-lined, dark, still. His hair was long and gray, tied back with a strip of hide. He wore the country's mix of old and borrowed, hide leggings under a canvas coat patched a dozen times, moccasins worn soft, a town hat gone shapeless with the years. The ranchers down the valley called him Ammon, which was not his name but the one they had given him, and he let them use it, because a name a man gives you is a small thing to let him keep. He stood without tension and without ease, alert all over, the way a deer is alert in the half-second before it decides about you. Croft set down the strap he was holding and showed his hands, open and away from his sides, the plain old courtesy of the territories. He said good morning. The old man looked at him a while, and at the instruments wrapped in canvas, and at the mules, taking the measure of the whole outfit. And then he looked back at Croft and asked, in English slow and exact, and laid out in an order just slightly not the order Croft would have used, where they meant to go, Croft told him. Up over the North Ridge, into the high valley, to make maps for the government. The old man's face did not change, but something in how he stood did. He looked past Croft, north, toward the ridge that hid the valley from where they stood, and when he looked back, there was a thing in his eyes that Croft could not name then, and spent years naming after. Not fear, something with more patience in it than fear has. Not that one, the old man said. Not this year. Croft asked him what he meant. Not this year. It was an odd way to warn a man off a place, and the oddness of it was what kept Croft listening. Instead of nodding the old man along the way, "You not a beggar or a preacher." The old man was quiet a moment, the way a man is quiet when he is moving a thing out of his own tongue into a borrowed one and wants to set it down right. Then he asked Croft if he had seen the stones up there. The stacked stones. Croft said he had not been up yet. The old man nodded, as if that were the trouble. All of it, in one piece. "White men think they are a fence," he said. "They are not a fence. They are a count." And he told them, standing there at the edge of the meadow, with the mules shifting and the creek going, the shape of the thing, in the plain flat way, you would tell a man which fords were safe. The stones, he said, had been stacked by the old people, one for a year, kept up, and added to for longer than his people had the valley in memory, longer than the memory had a beginning a man could point to. They were not set to keep anyone out. They were set to keep the count, because the valley was not always there to go into. Most years a man could walk over that north ridge and down into a high meadow like any other, and walk back out and never know a thing. But the valley came up, on its own long turning, the way a tide comes, except the tide of it was years and not hours. It came up and opened, and in the years it was open, it took a number. And the stones were how the old people had known, season to season, grandfather to grandfather, which years to keep their children and their stock and themselves down off that ridge. Croft asked him, careful and not mocking, because he had learned a long time before that mocking the old knowledge of a country was how a valley man got himself killed, what it was that took the number. An animal, bad ground, gas off the rock in a low place, the kind that could drop a man before he smelled it. And the old man said the thing that stayed with Croft to the end of his life. He said, "It does not kill what it takes. That is the part your people never hear right. You hear taken, and you think killed. It does not kill them. It keeps them. The way the ice keeps a thing, out of the running of the years. It holds them, and they do not rot, and they do not age, and they do not get free. And the worst of it is not that they are dead, because they are not dead. The worst of it is that they are kept." Croft asked him, because the measuring part of him could not help it, how anyone knew that, if the taken were kept and not killed. How anyone could know the difference, when no one came back to say. And the old man looked at him a while, and said that once, long ago, before the count in the stones was as long as it was now, the valley had given one back, not let go, given back, unasked. A man it had kept, and then in some later open year, for reasons no one living could tell, set out again at the edge of itself, unaged, the frost still on him, caught in the same instant of motion it had stopped him in, as though no time had passed, because for him none had. And that man had not been dead, and hadn't been mad, exactly. He had been a man for whom 30 years were one held breath, who walked back into a village of strangers, wearing the face of somebody their grandparents had set an empty box in the ground for, and who lived out a few wrong, quiet years among them, always cold, never sleeping, and taught them the one thing he had carried out, which was that it does not kill you. He kept saying it, the old man said, to anyone who would sit with him. It does not kill you, as though that were the comfort. as though that were not the whole of the horror. He let that sit. Then he said the last of it. He said this was an open year, the first in a long turning. He had read it off the stones himself when the snow let him up there in the spring. And he had come down to tell the valley families, the way it fell to him to do. And he had heard there were government men in the high meadow meaning to go north, and so he had walked up. Of all the years a man could pick to go into that valley, he said, this was the 1 year above all years to stay out of it. Then he was done. He did not argue it or dress it up. He had said the thing it was his to say. Roy had come over by then, quiet, and he asked the old man, not unkindly, how a stack of stones could know a year. The old man looked at him a while, and at the freckles, and the red hair, and the young face, and Croft thought he saw something cross the old man's expression, something that might have been recognition, and might have been only an old man's tiredness. He said only that the stones did not know anything. The men who had laid them had known and had written the knowing, down the only way that country gave them to write, which was 1 stone for 1 year, so that the count would outlast the men who kept it. You are a counting man, he said to Croft, who had told him nothing about himself. You will see it is a count. You will not be able to help yourself. Read it going in and turn around. And then he went back down the trail, easy and silent, and the trees took him inside of a dozen steps, and the sound of him was gone before the sight of him was. For a while, neither of them said anything. The creek ran. A mule stamped. Well, Roy said finally, I have heard old-timers warn off a place. I never heard one put a year on it. That was the thing that worked on Croft too, if he was honest, and he was not a man who let himself be worked on. A warning with no edges to it. A place is bad, spirits are there. He could have sat down and walked past, but the old man had not given him a fog. He had given him a mechanism. A count in stones, a turning of years, an open year and closed ones. It had the shape of a thing that could be true, and that was worse than any ghost story, because a ghost story you can disbelieve, and a mechanism you can only test. Let me put something to you here, while we are still standing in the meadow in the clean morning light, before anybody has gone anywhere. Have you ever had a warning land on you? Not as a feeling, but as a fact. Not, I have a bad feeling about this, which a man can talk himself out of in a minute, but a plain flat statement, said by somebody with no reason to lie and nothing to gain, that you could not argue with, and could not prove, and could not shake. Tell me about it down in the comments, because I think the warnings we break are not the wild ones. They are the reasonable ones, the ones with a count behind them, the ones we could have checked and chose not to, because checking would have meant believing, and believing would have meant turning around. Edmund Croft was a man who trusted what he could measure, and he had just been handed something he could measure. He should have measured it from the ridge and gone home. Instead, he finished loading the mules. The climb took the morning. It was steep but honest work. Long switchbacks through spruce and aspen that thinned as they rose, the trees giving way to wind-bent pine and then to bare rock and scattered snow that had not yet given up the high shade. They rested the mules often in the thin air. By a little afternoon they topped the north ridge, and for the first time they looked down into the valley close. It was smaller than Croft had judged from 2 ridges off. 2 miles, maybe, end to end, and 1/3 of a mile across at the widest. The floor of it flat and covered in a low brush that was the wrong color, a gray that was nearly black, with none of the meadow green that ought to have been there in June. A stream cut down the middle, a dark line, and the ridges held it close on both sides, so that the whole place had the feel of something cupped in two hands. It looked, Croft told himself, like 100 high valleys he had mapped, except for the light. He stood on the ridge, with a clear sky and a high sun, and the valley below was darker than it had any business being. The shadows in it deeper, the color drained, as though the light that went down into it did not all come back. He told himself it was the angle. He told himself it was the dark brush. He told himself the old man's words had set him up to see it, which was true, and did not help. Roy stood looking down with an expression Croft did not like, because Roy's face was usually so easy. "You feel that," Roy said. It was not a question. Croft did feel it. A wrongness with no name and no edge, and so he said no, and started down, because to say yes was to take it seriously, and to take it seriously was to be a man who turned back on the strength of a feeling, and Edmund Croft would not be that man. The descent was worse than the climb, a faint track through loose scree that slid underfoot, and they led the mules down a careful step at a time. And the moment they came off the slope onto the flat of the valley floor, the sound stopped. Not quieted. Stopped. There is a difference, and you do not know it until you have stood in it. No birds, no insects, no wind in the brush, though Croft could see the brush stir. The stream ran over its stones 20 yards off, and even it came muted. The water moving, but the sound of it held back, as though Croft were hearing it through a wall. He had been in lonesome country all his life, and there had always been something, the small, ambient hum of a living world. Here there was a silence with a body to it. The air felt thick. When he lifted his hand, the motion seemed to drag, a half-beat slow. He took out his compass to set a bearing, and the needle would not hold. It was not drifting the slow drift you get near an iron seam. It was turning, full circles, smooth and steady, as though north were in every direction at once and so in none. He tapped the case. It kept on. He took out the old brass one his father had carried, and it did the same, swinging and settling on nothing. Roy watched over his shoulder and said it low. "That ain't iron, is it?" And Croft said, "Magnetic anomaly," the words a man reaches for, to put a rail under his feet. And Roy did not answer, which was an answer. They went on into the valley leading the mules, the animals fighting them now, ears flat, trying at every step to turn back to the slope. The ground was firm, a little soft in places, covered in the black-green brush that up close was worse than from above. Knee-high, leaves too thick and waxy, no flower, and no seed on any of it, in the full middle of June. There was not one tree in the whole valley. There should have been pine on that floor, and willow along that stream, and there was nothing taller than the brush, as if something would not let a tall thing stand. The mules would not settle, and the mules were Roy's department, and Croft watched Roy fail to settle them with a quiet that told Croft more than anything yet. Roy could gentle anything on 4 legs. It was the thing he was for, and these 2 animals he had raised and packed for 6 weeks would not take his hand on their necks, would not drop their heads, stood splay-legged and trembling, with their ears pinned flat and their eyes showing white all the way around, turning, always turning, to keep their faces toward the head of the valley, toward the thing Croft could not yet see, the way a horse keeps its face to a fire. They would not crop the brush. Croft noted that, in the part of him that was always noting, the way a man clings to small facts in a place that is taking the big ones away from him. The grass and the brush of that whole valley floor, and not one animal in living memory had grazed it. And these two would not put their mouths to it now, though they had walked hard all morning. Whatever the ground was, the mules knew it was not food. The mules knew it was not ground. A third of the way in, they came on the first of the cairns. It was a stack of flat stones to about waist height, set by hands and not by rockfall, with the lichen on it that takes a slow, high country lifetime to grow. A rag of cloth on top had gone past any color, and a little bundle of something, dried plant, bound with sinew, gone to thread, sat under a stone, gone smooth. Roy walked around it without touching it. The stones he meant, he said. Croft crouched at it, and did the thing the old man had said he would not be able to help, the thing that was the whole shape of who Croft was. He counted it. The stones were not a heap. They were laid in courses, deliberate, and they could be counted. And he counted them, and wrote the number in his field book, and beside it, the time and the place. Because numbers were the floor he stood on, and right now, he needed a floor. They found the next cairn a few hundred yards deeper, and Croft counted that one too, out of the habit the old man had named in him. And he stopped with his pencil on the page, because the second count was smaller than the first. Not by chance, by a clean step, and the third, deeper still, smaller again by the same step. He stood there in the dead air with the book in his hand and understood, the way you understand a thing your whole body has known a moment before your mind will say it, that the old man had told the truth in every part. The cairns were a count. And walking into that valley, toward its head, he was not counting up, he was counting down. Something at the head of the valley was the zero, and every stack of stones between the ridge and that zero was the old people telling him, in the only writing their country gave them, how many he had left. Let me stop here a moment, because this is the place to do it. If you have come this far down into it with me, then you and I keep the kind of company that suits each other, and I would be glad to keep you longer. If you are not yet following along, do that now, would you? So the next dark night I light a fire like this one, you will be at it. And I will say the other thing plain, because it keeps happening. If you ever come on this account in some other voice, on a channel that is not this one, with my words coming out of a stranger's mouth, then they took the work without leave, and you would be doing me a kindness to say so. And a breath, before what comes next, because the worst of it is still ahead. There are 10 more of these waiting in the lantern records. The same slow kind of trouble I am telling you now, 5 hours of it, in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Go and find it after. For now, let me take you the rest of the way down that valley, toward the zero in the stones, because it was a little past the third cairn that Edmund Croft started to understand what the brush had been hiding, and why nothing in that valley grew tall, and what it was exactly that the ground was keeping. He had been seeing them all along. That was the thing he understood. Past the third cairn, and it turned him colder than the air had. He had been seeing them since they came off the slope, and his eye had been quietly filing them away, as stumps, as stones, as the dark humps of the brush, because those were the things a valley floor is supposed to hold. And the mind hands you the answer you expect. A half-second before, it will let you see the answer that is actually in front of you. It is a mercy, most days, that trick of the mind. It was not a mercy here. Here, it had only let him walk a half-mile deeper into the thing before it would let him understand where he was standing. The first one he let himself truly see was a mule, It stood off the track, maybe 30 feet, sunk to the knees in the black ground, and he had passed 3 others like it, taking them for boulders, before this one resolved all at once, the way a face will rise up out of a water stain on a ceiling, and then never let you see plain plaster again. A mule, gray all over, with something that was not quite frost, and did not melt and did not run, its head up, and turned a little to the side, as if it had caught a sound off to its left, 1 forefoot lifted and cocked, and never, ever set back down. It was not dead. His whole body knew that was the wrong word before his mind would supply a better one. A dead mule on a valley floor in June is a ruin. It is flies and bloat, and a smell that turns your stomach from 100 yards. This had none of that. It was whole. It was perfect. It was a living animal, stopped clean between one instant and the next. And the instant it had been stopped in was a very long time ago, and nothing had been allowed to touch it since. Not rot, not weather, not the years. It had simply been kept. After the mule, he could not unsee the rest, and he would have given a great deal to be able to. They were all through the valley, scattered thin near the ridge where he and Roy had come down, and thicker the farther in you looked, thickest of all up toward the head, where the cairns counted down to their 0. Once his eye had the trick of it, it would not stop handing them to him one after another, and each one was worse than the last, because each one was more clearly what it was. There was a deer caught mid-bound, legs gathered under it, going nowhere, and going there forever. There was the gray, weathered tongue of a wagon, and then the wagon behind it, sunk to the bed, of a build he had seen only in the oldest pictures in his grandfather's house, a thing of 60 years before, the canvas long gone off its boughs, but the boughs themselves still standing, held. A dog, mid-trot, ears up, and men. He made himself count them, because counting was the one rope he had left to hold, the habit the old man had named in him, the thing that was the whole shape of who Edmund Croft was. 1. A big man in miner's clothes, bent at the waist with both hands going down as if he had been lowering himself to drink at a stream that was not where he was kneeling. 2. A man in a long coat standing straight, hat in his hand, head bowed, for all the world like a man at a graveside. 3 and 4 close together, one with an arm flung out toward the other, the way you reach for somebody you're trying to pull back from an edge. 5 was a woman, her skirt gone gray and stiff as carved stone, one hand lifted to push hair out of her eyes that the wind had stopped pushing 100 years ago. He counted to 9, and his eye went to the 10th, and the 10th was the size of a child, and his mind shut the book. It simply would not turn that page, and I will not turn it for you either, because some things a man is allowed to leave uncounted. None of them had fallen. That was the part that came up the back of his neck and stayed there. In all his years in hard country, he had seen the dead in a good many attitudes, and the dead have one thing in common, which is that the earth has them. They are down. They have given their standing back to the ground. Not one figure in that valley had given up its standing. They were on their feet, on their hands and knees, reaching, bowing, turning, every one of them caught upright in the middle of the plain act of being alive, and held that way. Whatever had taken them had not laid them down. It had not had the least interest in laying them down. It had wanted them as they were, in motion, in the middle of their lives, and it had reached in and stopped the motion and kept the rest, the way you might press a flower in a book, not to kill it, only to keep it from ever being anything other than what it was the moment you close the page. and the smell had come up while he stood there, the one he had been half catching for an hour and refusing, because to name it was to admit it. It was not rot. He kept coming back to that in the papers, as though it mattered, and maybe it did. Rot he could have stood. Rot is the smell of the world doing its honest work, turning a thing back into ground. This was the opposite. Cold and mineral and old. The smell of deep water that has stood in the dark so long it has forgotten it was ever rain. The smell of a thing the world's honest work has not been let touch in longer than the world should allow. The light had begun to change. Not the slow, honest slide of a sun going west. The valley itself was dimming, from the ground up, the gray going to a deeper gray. The shadow rising out of the black brush, the way water fills a low place, and the cold coming up with it. A hard, dry January cold pushing into a June afternoon until Croft could see his own breath in front of him. He stood with his field book forgotten, open in his hand, and felt the open year come up to its height around him, though he had no words for it then. Felt the long turning the old man had spoken of, crest like a wave that has been 100 years rising, and is finally, quietly, about to break. He was looking at the nearest held man, the one in the long coat with his head bowed, 30 feet off, and making himself turn around, make himself walk back toward the slope and the daylight and the rest of his life, when Roy said his name. Once. Very low, Croft looked over. Roy was not looking at him. Roy had gone the gray-white of the frost on the figures, and he was staring up the valley toward the head of it, toward the thick of the held, and his mouth was moving with no sound coming out at all. "That's Wesley," Roy said. Croft asked him what. Who? His own voice came out wrong in the dead air, flat, swallowed before it left him. "My great-uncle Wesley." It did not sound like Roy's voice either. It had no floor under it. He went off this range in 1883, before my mother was even born. There's a tintype of him hung on her wall. Been on that wall my whole life. I have looked at it 1,000 times, and I am telling you, Mr. Croft, that is his face. That is the coat in the picture, and he has not got 1 day older than the day they sat him down and made it. Croft followed his eyes. 100 feet on toward the head of the valley, sunk to the knee in the black ground, stood a young man, bareheaded, fair-haired, his body turned mostly away, but his face come back around over his shoulder. The way a man's face comes around when somebody behind him has called his name, and he has started to turn to answer and been stopped before the turn was through. And even at that distance, even gray-rimed and held, Croft could see what Roy saw. The young held man and the young live man at Croft's side had the same brow, the same set to the jaw, the same family stamped on both faces across 30 years and a held generation, one frost gray and stopped and waiting, the other warm and breathing, and already, God help him, beginning to walk toward the first. "Roy," Croft said. "Roy, don't." But Roy was already going, and it was worse than running, because it was not running. He went out across that black valley floor toward the held man with a slow, sure, almost peaceful step, the step of a man walking up to somebody he loves and had long since given up for lost. And that is a step you cannot call back with a shout, because the part of a man that takes it is not the part that can hear you shouting. He went past a cairn, past the count, and never turned his head to it. And the cold came down another hard degree, and the light went down another shade toward true dark. And from up at the head of the valley, low and long and felt in the chest more than heard in the ear, Something began to sound, like the ground itself drawing one slow, enormous breath. And all across the valley floor, in the brush, near and far, every held figure at once, in a silence Croft felt against his teeth, began, very slowly, to move. The mule's lifted foot started down, not fast, slower than the hour hand of a clock, so slow you could not catch the motion happening, only know between one glance and the next that the foot was nearer the ground than it had been. The bowed man in the long coat began, by the width of a year, to raise his head. The two reaching figures drew a hair closer together. The woman's lifted hand moved toward her hair. The whole valley of the Kept was waking, all of it, taking back up the motion each had been stopped in, going on with 100 interrupted lives from the exact place each had been broken off. And up ahead, slow as all the rest, Wesley Meacham was finishing, after 28 years, the turnback over his shoulder, to see at last who it was that had called his name across all that time. And Roy was walking out to meet him, and Croft was alone at the edge of it, with his useless book in his hand, and the breath of the valley rising, and the light very nearly gone. Croft went after him. He will tell you, in the papers he left, that he did not decide to, that there was no moment of choosing, only that he was suddenly running across that black ground toward Roy's back, with his own voice tearing out of him, calling the boy's name, and the held figures turning their slow gray heads as he passed between them. He ran the way a man runs in the worst of a dream, and like the worst of a dream, the running did not work, because the ground was getting longer. I have read what he wrote about it more times than I would like, and I am going to give it to you as plainly as he set it down, because there is no dressing it up, and there is no explaining it. Roy was 100 feet ahead of him when he started. He ran, hard, a dozen strides, 20, the held figures sliding past him on either side, and when he looked up, Roy was farther away than when he had begun. Not because Roy was moving faster. Roy was still walking that same slow, sure walk. The distance between them was opening on its own. The valley floor was paying itself out between the two men, like rope off a spool, and every stride Croft spent was swallowed by ground that had not been there to cross a breath before. He stopped, because his body understood, before his mind would, that he could run in that place until his heart burst, and never close a yard of it, and he pulled the compass out, God knows why, the surveyor in him, reaching for the one instrument he had left, and the needle was not turning slow circles anymore. It was spinning, a blur, the way a thing spins when it is being pulled hard from every side at once. And Croft understood, standing there with the cold burning in his lungs and the long sound rising up out of the head of the valley, that north was not drifting. North was being drawn in. The whole valley was folding toward its center, toward the zero in the stones, gathering itself in, and the gathering was taking the distance and the directions and the daylight all down into the fold with it. The valley was closing, and it was closing the way a hand closes, slow, and from the outside in. "Roy!" he screamed it. The boy was small now, far up the lengthening floor, almost to the held man, to Wesley, to the great uncle with the family face who had stood there, turned over his shoulder for 30 years, waiting to finish saying yes to whoever had called him. And Roy reached him. Croft saw it across all that impossible opened ground. Roy reached his great uncle and put a hand on the old held coat, the way you would touch a person you had grieved and never thought to touch again. And then Roy stopped walking. He stopped between one step and the next, his own forward foot lifted and not set down, his own head beginning its slow turn, back over his shoulder, gray coming up over him like frost forming on a window from the corner in. And the long sound came up to its top and held, and the cold went through Croft to the middle of his bones, and the valley took its number. It was Roy. It had always been going to be Roy, from the moment they came off the slope. Maybe from the moment the old man read the stones in the spring, maybe from longer than that. It took the one number, and it kept him, the way it kept the mule and the wagon and the child and the great uncle with the family face, held on his feet in the act of living, out of the running of the years, and then it let Croft go. He did not run out. He was put out. That is the only honest way he ever found to say it. The fold that was drawing everything inward reached him and did not keep him. The way a current that pulls a swimmer down will sometimes, for no reason the swimmer ever learns, hand him back up to the air. One moment he was on the closing floor with the cold in his bones and the held all around him turning their heads. And the next, he was on the loose scree of the slope with the daylight ordinary and yellow, and the sound of his own breath loud in his ears, and a bird, a plain bird, calling somewhere up the ridge. Behind him there was no valley. There was a fold of green high mountainside running up to a north ridge, with a little stream coming down it, and pine on the floor of it, and willow along the water, the way there should always have been, the way there had never been an hour before. No black brush, no cairns a man could see from where he stood, no held figures, no Roy, just a high green draw in the afternoon sun, with two mules standing trembling at the foot of the slope, and no sign on the whole face of the earth that there had ever been anything there to be afraid of. Because between its open years, the valley is not there. That is the thing Croft spent the rest of his life knowing, and never being able to make another living soul believe. You cannot go and look at it. You can go and stand exactly where it was, on the right fold of the right ridge, and find nothing but ordinary mountain, and come home and tell everyone the old man was a liar, and the surveyor was mad, and you will be standing on the lid of it the whole time. He did not believe it, those first hours. He was a measuring man, and a measuring man does not accept that a valley 2 miles long has stopped existing because he wants it not to have. He climbed back up to the ridge that same evening, against everything his body was telling him, and he stood on the exact line he had shot that morning, and he looked down at a green high draw, with pine on its floor, and a stream, and willow, and not one black bush, and not one stone cairn, and not one held thing, and no Roy, and he took out his compass, and the needle settled north, and held as steady and honest as it had ever held in his life. He went down, and stood where their camp had been, and found grass, ordinary grass, and the print of their own boots from the morning, and nothing else. He called Roy's name until his voice gave out, and the only thing that came back was his own voice off the rock, which in that valley it never had. He stayed 3 days on that mountain, climbing to the ridge each dawn and going down each dark, and the valley did not come back up, because it had what it had come up for, and it had gone down to keep it. And a thing that sleeps a long turning of years does not wake again, because one man on a ridge cannot stop weeping. Croft got the mules down. He filed a survey for that quadrangle that any other man at the survey would have been ashamed of. A blank where the valley should have been, and a single line in a hand less steady than his usual, that the terrain did not match the approach and could not be charted and should not be attempted again. He left the geological survey within the year. A man whose whole life had been the belief that the world would hold still long enough to be measured does not keep the work after the world stops holding still. But he was a counting man. The old man had named that in him, at the edge of the meadow. And the old man had been right, and it turned out to be the one thing that did not break in Edmund Croft, and the one thing that would not let him rest. Because he had the count, he had the cairns in his field book, 2 of them numbered before the day went wrong, and the step between them. And he had a thing no one in that country had ever had before, a surveyor's training and a surveyor's records, and the patience to go looking. He spent the next 40 years on it. He gathered the vanishings, the way another man might gather stamps. A wagon and the family in it, gone off that country in the 1850s and never found. A sheep camp emptied in 71. The herder never come down. A hunting party short 1 man in 90. His own Roy in 1911. He laid them against the count in the stones and against the old records where he could find them, and slowly, the way he had once shot a line across a canyon, 1 careful angle at a time, he worked out the turning. He found the interval. He found how many years the valley sleeps, and how long it stays open when it comes up. And he built a table of it, forward and back, the open years of that valley running down the page, in his neat surveyor's column, the way elevations used to. The papers came to me by a long road I will not bore you with, and I have sat with them more nights than were good for me. The column runs forward past his own death. He kept it up to the end. An old man in a coast town, 1,000 miles from any mountain, going still on certain late summer evenings, his wife said, tilting his head as if he were listening to something a long way off, and not answering when she spoke to him until whatever it was had passed. He had married and done well enough, and been by all accounts a gentle and a careful man. But he never went back to Utah, and he kept a light burning by him every night of his life, and he counted. The last entries are the ones I cannot put down and walk away from, because the column does not stop at his lifetime. He ran it forward, the open years, on into a future he knew he would not see. And near the bottom of the page, in an old man's hand, one of those dates is circled. It is not far from now. I will not say it out loud, the year, because I have done that arithmetic too, the way he would have wanted somebody to, and I find that I would rather not be the voice that puts it in your ear on a quiet night. And under the circled year, he wrote 1 line, and it is the line I will leave you with, because 40 years of a careful man's counting came down to it. He wrote, "It takes a number in an open year, and it has not been paid since 1911. He wrote that an open year that goes by unpaid does not forgive the debt. It carries it. So that is the story, or the part of it I can give you with a clear conscience. And I will leave you with the thing I keep turning over, the thing the old man said at the edge of the meadow that I did not understand the first time, and understand a little too well now. He did not say never go there. A man can live his whole life by never. Never is easy. He said, not this year. And that is the warning we break, every one of us, given the chance. Not the wild warning, the reasonable one, the one with a count behind it, the one we could have checked, because checking would have meant believing, and believing would have meant turning around, and we are none of us as good at turning around as we think we are. Tell me, before you go, has anyone ever told you to stay away from a place and put a time on it? Not never, but not now. Not this road after dark, not that water in the spring, not that house in the year somebody died in it. Put it down in the comments, the place and the when, because I have come to believe the when is the part we are meanest to. and the part that was always trying hardest to save us. And if a story like this is one you would want the whole long evening of, The Lantern Records is waiting in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. 10 more of them. 5 hours of the dark. Listen to the ones who put a year on it. They are not guessing. And I will see you for the next one.